powerful earthquake has struck northeastern Japan.
That destroyed communities in seconds. As many as 1,000 homes burned.
Everywhere we look, things appear to be coming apart at the seams. Political tensions, civil upheaval, natural disasters, concern over governmental powers restricting personal freedoms. Every human effort that has ever been attempted at making a utopian society has ultimately failed, and now it appears as though we are on the verge of repeating that same course again. Is all of this pointing to something bigger? If so, then what? In a time of uncertainty, we can look to the Bible for answers. Join us now, as in the Scriptures, in association with the ministry It Is Written, as we bring you the series Revelation Today, The Great Reset, coming to you from Murphy, North Carolina. There's a lot of questions that people have regarding even just the validity of the Bible. Is it something that can be trusted at all? Arguments of how the Bible has been changed. It's nothing more than the works of men. And it's true. There have been alterations that have been made over the course of time, but most of them are very minuscule and have very little bearing on the overall message of the Bible. And it's very easy to actually take the time to figure out why these changes took place and how innocuous, really, they are in the course of the grander scheme of things. But these are the kinds of arguments that many people use. They'll throw out there. They've heard this idea before, but they really aren't sure how to back it up. Well, we're going to be kind of touching on some of these things as we go through the course of these meetings. But we have been looking at the world and wondering for a long time, where exactly are we headed? I remember a radio program that I used to listen to. This is when I lived up in upstate New York. And the title of the program was, Where Are We Headed and What's with the Handbasket? And the guy who hosted the program would get into a lot of current news stories, local stories, and so you can kind of assume what the overarching idea of the story was. And so when we look, though, at even just progress, most of us are pretty accustomed to having electric lights in our homes, aren't we? The world that we live in today was certainly not the world that our grandparents grew up in. It's certainly not even the world that our parents grew up in many cases. There has been rapid changes, a relentless forward march of progression. In fact, it wasn't until 1879 that Thomas Edison was the guy who produced a workable, practical light bulb. Now, of course, he wasn't the guy who invented the light bulb as we typically think of, but he's the guy who made it something practical and usable. Many of you may have heard the story about how he had 2,000 different attempts at trying to get a working light bulb to happen before he finally landed on the successful working model. And he was asked at one time, did you ever find yourself to be a failure having had so many models that came to nothing? And his response was no. What I did is I figured out 2,000 ways that the light bulb doesn't work. And so then until he came to his point of success. Now you talk about tenacity and perseverance. If we could have tenacity and perseverance like that when it comes to trying to dig into the Scriptures, then a lot of us will find us at that ultimate point of finding the success that God wants us to have. And I'm not talking financial success. I'm talking success in our relationship with Him, because that's really what counts. It doesn't matter what our bank accounts look like. It doesn't matter what any of these other peripheral issues are. We find real success when we have a working relationship with God. Even just 100 years ago, the world was gripped in prohibition, but even as far as electricity is concerned, there were more homes that had radios in them than what had telephones. But we've gone from models like this to almost everybody having a little mini computer in their pocket, which not only allows you to talk on the phone, but most all of us can communicate with people halfway around the world, just from our own little pocket devices. And incidentally, there are many countries around the world that use our smartphones as ways of gaining entry into businesses so they can track who has been there. Now you can, of course, make of that what you will. The point is that progress has been moving forward at a relentless pace. We've gone from homes that people went to bed when the sun went down because they didn't have electricity to now we can stay up all night if we want to. We've gone from having no power to having things like nuclear power, hydroelectric power, solar power, but not all of this has really come with good news to it, has it? There's been some setbacks. We've heard of oil tankers that have spilled millions of gallons of oil. We've heard of all these different kinds of things that have happened. There's been a price to pay with the march of progress. Henry Ford is accredited as being the guy who developed the automobile. But there were automobiles before Henry Ford. What Henry Ford developed was what we call the assembly line. Did he have the idea that it would lead to many of the issues that we face around the world today? There are places that you go to where you hardly want to breathe because the air is so thick, let alone just going down the highway sometimes. You get behind somebody who's driving some big, massive diesel or something, and you have your AC going on, and you turn it on to recycle the air because you don't want that diesel smoke coming into your vehicle and choking yourself out while you're following behind the road. And then, of course, we have gone to what we're all facing today. There's concerns over viruses and mandates, wearing masks, not wearing masks, get what we call the jab, not get the jab, the requirements that are being placed upon many people in many different places. There are even people here in this audience right now who have the potential of facing some very serious decisions over these topics. But this really isn't the first massive illness spread that we've ever faced. There have been pandemics before. There was the plague that struck Europe in the Middle Ages. Now, of course, when you look back at times, they didn't really understand how disease spread quite so well. And they were they were kind of sitting ducks in a sense because they really didn't understand this whole the carriers of disease. There was a time when cats were viewed as being the carriers of disease. Okay, and so nobody wanted cats around. And as a result of not having cats around, rodents had explosive populations, but they were the ones who were actually the carriers of the disease. So when people figured out that if they have cats around, the rodent populations diminished, guess what? Some of the spread of the disease diminished as well. We've also had the flu pandemic of 1918. My great-grandmother actually died in that pandemic shortly after my grandmother was born, but it killed millions of people worldwide, and it was a big deal. Of course, it led to a lot of advancements of knowledge concerning how disease worked, how vaccines work, how all these different things, how I have to just state how real vaccines work. And they've all kind of worked hand in hand. And all of this is part of that relentless march forward of progress, our knowledge of how things work, which then leads into technological advancements and so on and so forth. In fact, there are some times when somebody wants to develop some new technology, you have to build the machine that has to build the machine before you can build the machine, if that makes sense. But the world is groaning right now under a weight of pollution, under a weight of ecological disasters, under a weight of sickness, and even under a weight of economics. In fact, it was back in 1971 when a foundation was established in Switzerland by a German economist named Klaus Schwab. The group eventually became known as the World Economic Forum, and they hold their meetings in a Swiss town called Davos. And they're there every year, and it's attracted really a who's who of the rich and famous and influential. People such as Bill Gates have been there, Nelson Mandela has been there, even Yasser Arafat have been there, as well as a host of other political and economic figures from around the world. In fact, just before the whole pandemic issue even became a thing, there was a big, very important set of meetings that were to be taking place at the Vatican, where they were looking not just for political figures, but they were looking for sports figures, anybody who was of great influence, to come there and to discuss how is it that we can start making this great shift in the direction that we want the world to go in. Now, the whole thing kind of fell apart because the pandemic hit, and none of you have heard much of anything about this because there's been other stories that have come along that have covered that up into a mass grave of, we don't want you to know. That's ultimately what happened. And so in some degree, you can kind of think that maybe some of this pandemic stuff was actually a little bit of God's mercy in slowing down other progressions that might not necessarily be quite as good as we think them to be. But the world was really kind of set on its ear a little bit when Schwab made this statement. The pandemic represents a rare but narrow window of opportunity to reflect, reimagine, and reset our world. In fact, there's actually a website that's dedicated to this whole idea of a global reset. And there's a couple of statements that you can find on it. One of them is this: the COVID-19 crisis and the political, economic, and social disruptions it has caused is fundamentally changing the traditional context for decision making. The inconsistencies, inadequacies, and contradictions of multiple systems, from health and finance to energy and education, are more exposed than ever amidst a global context of concern for lives, livelihoods, and the planet. Leaders find themselves at a historic crossroads, managing short-term pressures against medium and long-term uncertainties. And there you can see where the website is found, but you can also see the date there. That's just back in September of last year. That's really not very long ago, is it? Here's another statement from that same website. The Great Reset Initiative has a set of dimensions to build a new social contract that honors the dignity of every human being. Now, that should kind of make your ears ring just a little bit, those kinds of phrases. Because ultimately, when you hear people, and this is on paper and in theory, that's a great idea, isn't it? To be able to honor everybody's dignity, right? But does it ever really pan out that way? Ultimately, while this is something that sounds good in theory, in practice, what this really means is the ones who are trumpeting these kinds of calls are saying, you need to tolerate me, but I don't need to tolerate you. You're the one who has to change, not me. That's ultimately what's behind a lot of these kinds of statements. But you know, whether it is an issue of economics or whether it is from a World Economic Forum, we have to understand that they're not a very large group. They're not the United Nations, but they are very influential. And one has to wonder what the rich and powerful have in mind when they're speaking about this great reset. And this question has many people wondering. The gap between the rich and the poor has never been greater than it is now, and it just seems to be widening more and more almost on a daily basis. Is it time for a great reset? And if it is, then who decides what that should look like? Now let's remember that every human has been trying to, well, not every human, but human beings have been trying to improve themselves throughout the ages. There have been countless attempts at trying to make ourselves better as a society. Every single one of them has fallen on its face. It's been tried in different ways of environmental improvements, social improvements, political, economic, over and over and over again. And we're going to get into some of these as these meetings progress, but they've all fallen apart. Many of them have had somewhat we can think of as short-term apparent success, but ultimately what you finally get to is a point where there becomes a power struggle, and that's where things start to fall apart. Who's going to be the one who's ultimately in charge of what's going on? There are people who talk about what's called anarchism. Now, of course, here's the funny thing is many people try to redefine words. Okay? Just because we try to redefine words doesn't really change what the words really mean. Now, when we think of anarchy, what do we think of? We think of as a lack of rule, right? A lack of control, because that's really what the word anarchy means. It's a word that comes from the Greek language. Arche means ruler or king, and when you put the letter A at the front of those kinds of words, it means an absence of. So anarchy is an absence of a ruler, absence of rulership, really, or of rules for people to follow. But you hear people who talk about we need to have true anarchy, and what they mean by that is they want to have a society where everybody has a voice and nobody makes a decision until everybody agrees that we can move forward. But the problem is you can never really truly have that. Because after you've had all the discussion that any group can possibly have over any topic that you can think of, the instant somebody steps forward and says, okay, now we need to take a vote. Guess what? Somebody just took a leadership position and has completely torn the fabric of anarchy apart, because now you have somebody who's stepping into a leadership role. So anarchy True anarchy, the way they try to define it, cannot exist. Otherwise, you would never have anybody being able to move a group of people to make a decision. Ever. It would never happen. But is this stuff that the Bible gets to? Is this stuff that we can truly rely upon? Are there answers that we can find that are applicable to today? I mean, let's admit, the Bible was written a really long time ago. It was written in a very different cultural context, very different languages from what you and I use, very different time and place from where any of us exist. Is the message of the Scriptures still applicable to us today? Is this something that we can truly sink our teeth into and know that this isn't just some old archaic message that was meant for people a long time ago who lived in a very different place in a very different time and doesn't have any bearing for us left today? Well, when we take a look at what the Bible has to offer, we see that it really does have a lot of bearing today. In Genesis, we have the story where God creates the world. He does it in 6 days and pronounces everything at the end of that very good, right? We've all read the Genesis account before, but we also know what happened next, don't we? There's this whole story that follows right after the story of creation where sin enters the world. Temptation was laid there for Adam and Eve. They fell into it, and the world itself was cursed as a result of their falling into temptation. It all fell apart pretty quick. It doesn't take us very long to get down through the story in Genesis and find murder has already begun to happen. There's theft that's happening. I mean, everything went from very good to very bad very quick. But there's also something that we have to recognize as well. You know, the Bible is a tremendous book that starts and ends very good, and then our story is in between. How is it that the story of the Bible ends? Well, let's take a look at Revelation chapter 21. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. And then just a few verses later in that same chapter, it says, "And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes, and there shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying. Neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things have passed away." And then just again, a few verses later, we have this, "And there shall be no more curse." Now, right now, every single one of us are living under a curse. None of us have a choice on that issue. We're all stuck here like we're in a rut that's piled up around our tires and we just can't move. We need somebody to come along with the cosmic wrecker to wrap a chain around our front end and pull us out of the mud because we can't get out of it by ourselves, which leads us to a real reset. Now, we can try to talk about the political resets all we want to, but they pale in comparison to the real reset that's coming, the one that you want to be a part of. The Bible actually says something a little bit about this. The last chapter of Daniel, it says, "A time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time." Now, we read that there's going to be these 7 last plagues before the world is reset. There's going to be some things called the mark of the beast, and there's all these different things that come up in Revelation, and there's a whole bunch of different kind of interpretations for what these things mean. In fact, it says that those who don't receive the mark of the beast will be killed. Now, I mean, that kind of puts a pretty hefty total on what that will be. Makes you really think, wow, is this something that I really want to get? I mean, this is serious. The greatest curse in the Bible is pronounced upon those who receive the mark of the beast, and then is also the greatest toll pushed by man on those who will not receive the mark of the beast. Now, this is some pretty serious stuff. Either have to deal with the wrath of mankind or deal with the wrath of God. Seems to put us all between a pretty hard spot, doesn't it? Jesus also had a little something to say about this as well in Matthew chapter 24. "Nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places." But we may be getting kind of ahead of ourselves with some of this stuff. But before we get too much into things like tribulations and trials and marks and seals and all of these various things, we're going to take some time to get some broad strokes, because that's really how the Bible starts with painting the picture of Bible prophecy. It starts with very broad strokes. And then it goes back and fills in some details. And then it's like an artist who goes back in again and fills in even more details. I don't know how many of you have ever watched a painter work. And I'm not talking about somebody who paints walls. I'm talking about somebody who paints beautiful pictures. I've only had the privilege of knowing a handful of fine artists. And what I have seen is they don't just sit down and rip something out real quick and, okay, here you go. They take their time and they master what they're doing. They focus on one little area and they make that part what they want. Then they go and focus on something else. And there'll be times when they'll paint their entire picture, but if there are people in it, they leave the face for last. Some of them do anyway. And then after they've painted everything else, then they go in and work on the very fine details of painting the face. Bible prophecy is very much like that. It's broad strokes, and then it comes back again over the same thing and gives you additional details, and then it comes back again and gives you even more fine detail so that we kind of have this three-dimensional view of what's happening. So we can be in a position of knowing who the man behind the curtain is doing and what he's doing. God does not want us to be deceived. Think about it. If the mark of the beast is the thing that from which the greatest curse in the Bible is pronounced upon those who receive it, is God going to say, here it is, and then not tell you what it is? So that you run around scared of everything, trying to avoid it like it's a cold. Does that sound like a loving, merciful, kind God? That sounds kind of more like somebody vindictive. But God isn't like that. At least the God that I read about in the Bible isn't quite like that. Instead, God is one who gives us all the information that we need. Now, there are times that we have to look past our traditional ideas. There are times we have to allow ourselves to question what it is that we have been told over time. There are times we have to be willing to, regardless of what favorite minister we may have seen on TV or what grandma may have told us years ago, we have to allow ourselves to question those things. Because who do we ultimately have to give a reckoning to? Is it our favorite preacher? Is it our grandma? Or is it God? Who do we have to stand before and give an account of ourselves? Now, I know some people who, as they have learned certain things over time, they recognize their truthfulness, but they also refused to make a forward decision on certain things because it wasn't what their mama told them. And they were stuck in that position. They felt that if they started making certain changes in their life, that they were going to dishonor their mother. Now, this person's mother may not have known these certain things that this person was learning. But you would think that what the mother was truly trying to do was to get their child to love God and to love the Scriptures. And when that becomes our motive, love for God and a love for the Scriptures, we will gravitate to the truth regardless of who it is it has come from. Because the truth is what matters. God is what matters, not what we think we know. Okay? So we have to allow ourselves at least the opportunity to be open to differing ideas. Now, there are, of course, a multitude of varying interpretations of the Bible. I mean, the reason that there are literally thousands of Christian denominations, that's just Christian denominations, let alone everything else that you can think of. The reason that there are so many different denominations is because there's so many different points of view. Okay? Nobody says, well, we're just going to build a whole nother church just because we want to. They usually have some reason behind it, whether it's some kind of a schism that has split a church, or it's people who have argued over points of doctrine and they say, well, we don't agree with you anymore, so we're going to go off in this direction. I mean, that happens a lot throughout the course of time. That's one of the reasons why we have so many denominations. But what we're going to do is we're going to do our best through this series of presentations and tonight to allow the Bible to speak for itself. Okay? I'm going to say that once again because it is of vital importance to allow the Bible to speak for itself. Too often what ends up happening is we read a little something from the Scriptures and then we add a little bit of our own ideas to it. We can't read the Bible through contemporary eyes, through kind of current events type of understanding. Once we do that, we're trying to take our present day and inject it into texts that were written a really long time ago. But the truth of the matter is this: the Bible was written in a way that was for the people that it was written to. It was written in a way they would understand it. Okay? What we have to do is figure out how they would have understood it, and then we can apply it to ourselves. That's really how the whole thing works. So we're going to open this program by stepping back in time. We're going to spend tonight in the book of Daniel, but we're going to back up to an ancient city that used to be really a hub of everything in its heyday. It's the city of Babylon. We're going to step into a time of a king whose name was Nebuchadnezzar. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, I'll give you a little snippet of some things here. Nebuchadnezzar was a guy that you did not mess with. You didn't cross Nebuchadnezzar. And we'll kind of get into some of that as we progress through these meetings. I know I keep saying that, but I do mean it. We're going to get into these things as we go. But to kind of give you an idea, Nebuchadnezzar isn't somebody who's only mentioned in Daniel. In fact, I've had the privilege of knowing people from the Middle East. In fact, one of my friends for quite some time was actually born and grew up in Egypt, and went to their school systems there and finally came to the U.S. When he went into graduate school. So he was very much aware of how life in the Middle East was. That's where home was for him. And then I had the opportunity of meeting a young lady from Iraq. Okay, and so she could kind of give me a perspective of what life in Iraq was really like. Now, when we study American history, we have certain figures that come up. Name one of those figures. Lincoln, right, Abraham Lincoln. Who else? Robert E. Lee, George Washington. There are all, John Adams. There's all these names that come up as we study American history, right? Now, whether or not we want to question different things about them, that's besides the point. That's not the point. The point is these are the names that come up when we study American history. When the people in the Middle East study Middle Eastern history, guess what one of the names is that they study? Nebuchadnezzar. He's not just some fictional character from the pages of the Bible. He was a very real individual. In fact, most of you might remember the name Saddam Hussein. Okay? He was actually trying to rebuild the city of Babylon because he fancied himself a new Nebuchadnezzar. Well, we all know how that turned out. But Nebuchadnezzar was somebody that people in the Middle East emulate. He had a very powerful and wealthy kingdom, and ever since it has fallen apart, it has been the desire of rulers in that part of the world to make a new Babylon, okay? To be the next Nebuchadnezzar, because that was a pinnacle of influence and power. But here in the book of 2 Kings, it tells us a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. And at that time, the servants of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came up against Jerusalem, and the city was besieged. And Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came against the city, and his servants did besiege it. Now, there's this little kind of repeating thing that happens in ancient Hebrew texts. We find it quite often, where they give this long list of words, and then they say the same thing again and give the exact same list. I don't know necessarily what the point is, but it kind of puts emphasis on things when they repeat it like that. And then we find this in the first chapter of Daniel. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, unto Jerusalem to besiege it. So we know that Nebuchadnezzar is this very real figure. In fact, some of you may even know the story of why Nebuchadnezzar came. You might remember the story of Hezekiah and the lengthening of his life and the whole, turning the sun back and all that kind of stuff. And the Babylonians heard about all of this. They came to see this king, and rather than Hezekiah proclaiming God to them, what does he do instead? He shows them his treasure house, right? He proclaims to them all the great riches that he had. Then these Babylonians say, this is rather nice. So they go back home, they tell their king, they have a beautiful temple that's full of gold shields and gold candlesticks and gold tables, and my, what a wonderful addition to the temple these things would be. And a few years go by, and who comes along but Nebuchadnezzar seizes Babylon on his bid to establish himself as the reigning world monarch. And so then we land on this story. This comes to us from Daniel chapter 2. Now, in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was troubled that his sleep left him. So this guy, Nebuchadnezzar, and I'm going to touch on why this was such a big deal in just a little bit. But this guy, Nebuchadnezzar, this kind of a worldly king of kings, monarchs would come to him to gain permission for things along their own path of leadership, and he was somebody that they would come to ask permission to do things, to gain money from, and so on and so forth. This guy had this dream, just something as simple as a dream that was so troubling to him that he couldn't sleep. It jarred him out of his sleep and could not allow him to go back to sleep. And what was the result of that greatly troubling dream? What happens? Then the king gave the command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aramaic. O king, live forever. Tell your servants to dream, and we will we will give you the interpretation. That's ultimately what they were driving at, is trying to make something up. They were looking to drive up time because Nebuchadnezzar requested something of them that was absolutely impossible for them to do. Here's this king who has probably one of the greatest cases of insomnia in history. This dream that stirs him out of his sleep. The guy who was supposed to be sitting on the pinnacle of the world at the time. Nothing was supposed to be able to touch this guy, but a dream is what stirs him to anxiety. So much so that he has all these people come in and demand that he tells them what this dream means. But he goes beyond just having them tell him what the dream is. And so these magicians, these astrologers, these sorcerers, which are really nothing more than ancient terms for what we call psychics today, they say, hey, you need to give us a little bit of time. But Nebuchadnezzar, again, was not somebody to mess with. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. Now, right there is the evidence of why you don't mess with Nebuchadnezzar. This whole cutting people in pieces and burning their homes down was a bit of a thing for him because it comes up more than once in the book of Daniel. But what is it that he is requesting for these people to do? Is it to simply give him the interpretation of his dream? This is what I dreamed, and this, and this, and this. Oh, well, king, this is what this means, and let's throw these bones over here and see how it lays. Oh, that's what that means. That's the kind of thing that they would do, okay? They would take the liver of an animal, cut it, watch how the blood comes out, and say, oh, well, this is the pattern that develops, so that's what this means, and all this kind of stuff. It was a bunch of nonsense. But there was something else that the king requested of them that they knew they could not do. Did you catch it in this verse? You tell me the dream. Now, how many of you have ever been able to tell somebody else what their dream is? Not what it meant, but just what the dream is. I've never been able to do that. And I'm pretty sure none of you have been able to dream what somebody else has dreamed either, and to tell them, this is the dream that you had last night. Oh, that's extraordinary. If somebody could tell you a dream that you had, would you not say they could tell me what it meant too? That's what the king is doing. He's telling these guys who are supposed to be the wise men, right? That's a term that gets thrown around pretty loosely in the Bible, but they were supposed to be the wise men of the time who would be able to tell all of these important things to the king. And he was like, no, you need to not only tell me what it means, you need to tell me the dream first. Then I will know that you can tell me what the dream means. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. So now Nebuchadnezzar is he's putting it to these guys. There was no way out of what it was that he was talking about. If they didn't do what he was asking, not only would they be put to death, but their families would be killed as well. Okay, that's kind of the whole idea of burning their houses down. It's not let your families, your wives, and your children out, and then we'll burn your house down. No, it's we're going to lock your doors and windows. Your family's going to be inside, and we're going to torch it. So not only are you going to die, they're going to die too. Nebuchadnezzar was not somebody to be trifled with. And he meant business. It's impossible really to underestimate how powerful this man was. And it just kind of really echoes the power and the royalty that he carried. So now let me ask you, can people really see the future? Now, there are lots of things that are out there, people who claim they can. We've all heard of things like the Da Vinci Code, right? Now, of course, that kind of gets into it really gets off into the weeds about Jesus and Mary and all that kind of stuff. I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole tonight. You want to talk about that, I'll talk about it later. But we have people who do palm readings, and they look at the stars, and they do all these, people who open up the newspaper and look at the horoscopes, and, this is what my future is going to be. We end up looking for certainty in our futures in all the wrong places in many cases. We need to be looking at Christ and just simply trust in the promises that we find in the scriptures and relying upon him for our daily needs and to get us through whatever our concerns are, trusting that what his plan is better than what any psychic or fortune teller could possibly come up with. As humans, we're hardwired to dislike and avoid uncertainty, and it produces acute stress responses. So, when we cannot know how our futures will play out, it's understandable that we should turn in ever greater numbers towards astrology for clues. Of course, the information our horoscopes proffer is not steadfast in its accuracy by any means, but astrology does give some sense of control over our lives. So what you'll see tonight is that you can go to God and trust him. You can commit yourself to following the leading of one who made you, and you can sleep at night knowing that you're getting really the best direction from him that you possibly can muster. These Babylonian wise men were people who were trying to use things like astrology. They were predicting the future based on movements of the stars and all kinds of external things. Nothing that really has any bearing on who we are as people or what our futures are in. They answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation." The king answered and said, "I know for a certainty that you would gain time because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give its interpretation." The Chaldeans answered the king and said, "There is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter." The first truth that came out of their mouths so far. Nobody can do what the king is demanding. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such things of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. So at least there's some modicum of hope for these guys. They recognize a limitation that they have, and they recognize that the only one who can help them is those who are dwelling with divinity. Now, of course, they're talking about gods, plural, multiple gods, but the Bible tells us that there's only one God, right? So to some degree, they're right in what they're saying, comparing to their understanding of how the gods and everything work. But what they are recognizing is that they don't have the ability to do what the king is requiring them to do. And there's like it's silly. You can't request this of us. No one has ever requested this of us because no one can do what you're requesting. They're essentially saying we're frauds and we know it and you know it too now. And so now we're stuck in this position where the only one who can help us is if God himself were to come down and tell somebody what this is all going to happen, what this is going to mean, to tell him what your dream is going to be. Well, that's really how it is that it turns out. For this reason, the king was angry and very furious and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. Then Daniel went to his house and made the decision known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, that they might seek mercies from the God of heaven concerning the secret, so that Daniel and his companions might not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. So let me ask you this. Are you in a position where you might need an answer to prayer? Daniel and his friends were most certainly in a literal life and death circumstance where they were needing an answer to prayer that in many cases, unless you are pouring your heart out to God, it wouldn't have come any other way. There is no just kind of chance happening that something would just kind of go the other direction for this. Do you need encouragement tonight? Well, then let's get into the habit of praying and asking God to take our concerns. Take your cares to God. Peter wrote that we can cast all of our cares upon him because he cares for us. In our Milky Way galaxy, there is at least 100,000 light years across. And yet, in the midst of that great vastness, there is a God that when you pray, he listens. In the midst of all that God has going on, he listens to your prayers because he cares about what's going on in your life. So Daniel, the story tells us that they pray to God and God reveals the dream to him. So then Daniel eventually appears before the king again, and he begins telling the king what the dream was. You, O king, were watching, and behold, a great image. This great image, whose splendor was excellent, stood before you, and its form was awesome. This image's head was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. You watched while a stone was cut out without hands, which struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were crushed together and became like chaff from the summer threshing floor. The wind carried them away so that no trace of them was found. And the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This is the dream. Now I will tell the interpretation of it before the king. You can just imagine that as Daniel was relating all these things, that the king, who was just told that nobody could do this, was beginning to say, wow, yeah, okay, now I need to listen to this guy Daniel because he's just telling me what I was dreaming. So he's gotten to this point now where he has now had the dream revealed to him, and he knows that he can trust this guy Daniel. If Daniel can reveal in his own words that we just read, if you can tell me the dream, then I will know that you can give me the interpretation. Did Daniel just tell him the dream? Yes, he did. So by the king's own words, will he now trust Daniel to tell him the interpretation? The Bible really has all the answers for us if we will let it tell us what these answers are. God reveals to us what will take place in this dream from the time that it is given over the course of the next at least 2,500 years of human history and beyond. Now realize this, God puts himself really on the line here. If what God says isn't true, then I would encourage you to walk away from the Bible right now. Because if it isn't true, then it's just a waste of time. If it isn't true, then what are we really doing? We're forcing ourselves to take a square peg and pound it into a round hole if the Bible isn't true. How much of the stuff in the Bible goes against human nature? A whole bunch. Love your enemy? That's not human nature, friends. Okay? But what is human nature? Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. Hurt me, I'll hurt you twice. Right? That's human nature. But if what God says isn't true, then why should we bother trying to force ourselves to be what God or what our nature does not demand that we are? But if it is true, then that means that there is a possibility for us to be changed, for us to be corrected into what is true and correct and godly behavior, to take divine nature and have that infused into our nature so that we can love our enemies. Because by ourselves, loving our enemies is impossible. We can do it only for a short time. We don't do it successfully without the leading of God's Holy Spirit. So if we can trust the Bible, though, then we can know that what is being placed here is something that if God is revealing openly human history over a course of 2,500 years, then we can know that the rest of the Bible, it can also be true and trustworthy. The scriptures themselves even say all scripture is inspired by God. All scripture, not just the parts we like, and then the parts we don't like we can cast aside. All scripture. That means we need to even take the parts we don't like and figure out how to understand them. That means there are times when it looks like a square peg being pounded into a round hole when we try to apply our own understanding to things. But if we allow God to change our way of thinking into what it is that we're looking at, then suddenly it's a square peg into a square hole. It all starts to make sense if we will allow ourselves to see it. So now let's move on here and look at what Daniel says. You, O king, are a king of kings, for the God of heaven has given you a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherever the children of men dwell, or the beasts of the field and the birds of the heaven. He has given them into your hand and has made you ruler over them all. You are this head of gold. Well, you can just imagine Nebuchadnezzar's ego got puffed up quite a bit right there. I am this head of gold. That's incredible. Babylon was established as a world empire in the year 605 BC, and it reigned until around about 539 BC. It was known as the Golden Empire. There were a lot, 2 of the 7 ancient wonders of the world were a part of the city of Babylon, the Hanging Gardens and the Wall of Babylon. But the city of Babylon was one of the largest cities in ancient times. It was larger than the city of Rome. It was larger than the city of Athens. There was actually an altar and a throne made from 8.5 tons of solid gold. Okay? Now, by any means, by any standards that you can possibly use, that's a lot of gold. Okay? The city of Babylon was known as the Golden Empire, the Golden City. That's how Babylon was referred to. In fact, this is something that was found in an inscription in Babylon that Nebuchadnezzar had this made. The whole earth was prostrate at Babylon's feet. Babylon, the city which is the delight of my eyes, which I have glorified, may it last forever. What is it that Daniel then goes on to say? But after you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours. Now, all historians can tell you that the city of Babylon was conquered by the coalition of the Medes and the Persians in the year 538 BC. And the Medo-Persian coalition lasted until around about the year 331 BC. Then Daniel goes on. He says, then a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over all the earth. Does anybody know who it is that defeated the Medo-Persian army? There was a guy by the name of Alexander the Great who headed the Grecian army, which defeated them at the Battle of Arbela in 331 BC, and the Grecian Empire lasted until 168 BC. But Daniel continues and it says, and the fourth kingdom shall be as strong as iron, inasmuch as iron breaks in pieces and shatters everything, and like iron that crushes, that kingdom will break in pieces and crush all others. Now, before I get into this next slide, I want to point something out. First of all, the head was what? Fine gold. Daniel even tells Nebuchadnezzar, you are this head of gold. Okay? There was enormous amounts of gold within the city of Babylon. It was a wealthy city. It was a wealthy empire. And it was known as the Golden Empire. So you can kind of see how gold aptly represents Babylon, right? Now, when the Medes and the Persians come along and they defeat Babylon, they incidentally used silver for their currency. And it's a detail that we shouldn't let escape our attention, that there's 2 arms on this image. This image is of a man. 2 arms, the Medes and the Persians. A coalition of 2, and they use silver as their currency. Now are we beginning to see chest and arms of silver? It kind of aptly represents the Medes and the Persians, right? And then we have the belly and the thighs of bronze or brass, depending on what version of the Bible one might be reading. But those represented the Greeks. Why? Because they had tons of brass within their military. Their helmets, their shields, their spear tips, a lot of their swords. There was a lot of bronze that they were using, or brass that they were using in their military. So you can see how it is that these various minerals very aptly represent the kingdom that is talking about. Now, does anybody know who it was that finally defeated the Greeks and knocked them off the world stage of world superpowers? Rome took over in 168 BC, and they lasted till 476 AD. Now, we have so far, starting in 605 BC, from the time of Babylon down to the time of Rome, we've passed over 600 years of time, and incidentally, this is all being predicted before the time of Christ. Now, who was the ruling power in the time of Christ? It was Rome. They were the ones who were there seated in that position of authority. It was those iron Roman nails that nailed Jesus to the cross. Rome was known as the Iron Empire. They had in their armaments, just like the Greeks used a lot of bronze, the Romans used a lot of iron. Now, you take an iron sword and you smack it against a bronze shield, what happens? The bronze shield breaks. It didn't take long for the Romans to conquer the Greeks because they just had better stuff. The Romans also were really the first people to have like a paid regular military. Everybody else was just volunteer, or they were forced into serving in the army. Go serve in the army or your family dies kind of thing, okay? So there were a lot of people who were forced into this. But Rome actually had a trained, paid military, much like what we see today. What happens to Rome? Whereas you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, the kingdom shall be divided, yet the strength of the iron shall be in it, just as you saw the iron mixed with ceramic clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly of iron and partly of clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly fragile. As you saw iron mixed with ceramic clay, they will mingle with the seed of men, but they will not adhere one to another, just as iron does not mix with clay. So what ended up happening to that great, powerful kingdom or empire of Rome? It ended up shattering into a multitude of nations and becoming eventually what we would know today as the nations of Europe. Now, what is it that ended up happening through the course of European history? You had people like Napoleon, Hitler, Kaiser Wilhelm, and others all have made attempts at trying to weld Europe back together. World War I, World War II, all failed, all had some short-term apparent success. I mean, the whole world looked like Hitler was going to be successful until he was stopped dead in his tracks and then finally pushed back. Queen Victoria, Queen of England, was at one point in time known as the grandmother of Europe, and King Christian IX of Denmark was known as the father-in-law of Europe. Now, do you know why they were known as these, the grandmother of Europe and the father-in-law of Europe? The Queen of England, Queen Victoria, had so many children and married them off to these various dignitaries that she was either the mother or grandmother or aunt to all the people who were in power throughout Europe. So she tried to weld Europe back together through marriage. Okay? Now, I mean, who's going to want to go to war against grandma? Nobody's going to want to do that. Her attempt at welding the power back together was through marrying off her children. Today, it's being done through economics. And there has been some apparent success in all of that. But what has been the big news coming out of Europe in the last few years? We call it Brexit, right? Here we have Britain or England that has left the European Union. It sent the whole thing kind of teetering. You have other countries who are a part of the European Union. Greece, which is hanging on by a thread to be a part of the European Union. Other nations that their economies are teetering, but there are other countries whose economies are quite strong. Partly strong, partly fragile. And guess what? They're not really adhering together very well, are they? Especially if England has just separated itself from the EU because it didn't like the partnership. And you have other nations that are also playing with the exact same ideas right now. They might call themselves the European Union, but they're really not very unified at all. And this is exactly what the Bible predicted. Now, I'm not having to read into this. And if you want to call me out on thinking that I'm reading into this, then by all means, go ahead and do it. But the details of history line up exactly with everything that we are seeing happen. And as we continue pressing forward, what are some of the attempts that are being used to try to further weld people together right now? But it's this great cry for the environment, right? Global warming. Back the clock up about 40 years. What was the big issue then? Global cooling. Exactly. The earth was turning into a refrigerator. Now it's turning into a sauna. Let's give it another 40 years. I'm sure it'll start cooling off again. But they're using all of these things in an attempt to scare people into unification. Nothing quite like fear as a way of motivating people to make the decisions you want them to make. We've all seen that over the course of the last 2 years, using fear to drive people to make decisions. Let alone the fact, when you look at how the global economy is really so interdependent on each other, and you take ships and you jam them up in a place like the Suez Canal, what then starts to happen? Well, the cargo that they're carrying doesn't get to where it needs to be, prices go up, stocks go down, and you have shortages. This is exactly what we've seen happen not too long ago. We've even seen it with a whole fleet of ships stuck out in the Pacific Ocean, not being able to offload their cargo. And what do we see happening around us now here? Shelves that are going empty, prices that are going up, okay? And All of this stuff is pointing to the fact that the world is so on the edge of falling over, it's closer than you might realize. Chains and prices and all of these issues, and then when you start throwing in the mix of pandemics and sicknesses to scare people even further, then the issues just become more blatant and apparent and wide open. But the question is, what's really happening? One of the things that has happened is that people are more divided now than they have ever been. We're trying to talk about unity in the various stories that are in the news, and people are so disunified, it seems like unity is nothing but a dream in the distant future. Everybody talks about how we want to bring everybody together, but nobody can seem to come together. There's a reason why we can't come together. It's because we're all living under the same curse of sin. Sin is what prevents that from happening. But this isn't finished. Daniel goes on to say a few things more here. And in the days of these kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people. It shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. Inasmuch as you saw the stone was cut out of the mountain without hands, and that it broke in pieces the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold, the great God has made known to the king what will come to pass after this. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. So Daniel laid out for Nebuchadnezzar what would end up happening. The rise and fall of Babylon, the rise and fall of the Medo-Persian Empire, the Grecian Empire, the Roman Empire. Now you see those other animals on the corner or on the other side right there. We're going to get to those on another night, but that's in a later chapter of Daniel, and we're going to see just exactly how the very same information is being related to us a second time. Let alone the fact that when Rome finally fell apart, it was divided into 10 nations. 3 of those nations no longer exist, which is another detail that becomes extremely important later on as we get into another presentation on this very stuff. And right now, my friends, we are living down in the toenail fungus of that statue. 1997, a 2-year-old boy was abducted near his home in eastern China, apparently by a couple who had ended up selling the boy into trafficking. Police investigated and they came up with nothing. But the father decided that he wasn't just going to kind of give up on the story of his son that had been taken from him. So he followed the trail as far as he could. He rode for, check this out, 310,000 miles on 10 different motorcycles, spending his life savings desperately seeking his son. He traveled the world over multiple times trying to follow this trail of where his son had gone. Now, over the course of time, he was eventually able to be reunited with his son 27 years later. Okay? Entire childhood gone. He's now an adult, but the father never gave up. He kept seeking after his son. Today we are living in a world where our Father has not given up. He is continuing to seek after those who are seeking after him. Because there are some very important events on the horizon. Some of them are already happening. Because what's really important is that this is a moment that is not very far off. People have been saying that for years, I know, but every time we open up the newspaper, every time we look at what's going on in the world, we see that this is closer every day. The question we have to ask ourselves is, are we going to be ready for that when it comes? What does God require of those to be ready for that? Is this something that we have to do by ourselves? Well, the answer to that is no. But we have to allow God to make those changes in us. We have to partner with God. That has been the whole issue from the very beginning. Is God and humanity working together? He has always been looking for those who will partner with the work of his Holy Spirit to allow themselves to be changed and to see the change for others that take place in their life. Now, I don't necessarily know where you stand with God tonight. If you're here, obviously you're interested in who he is and what he has for our futures. And we're going to get into a lot more details of things that have taken place in the past, things that are taking place now, and things that are going to take place in the very near future. And I'm not going to do any kind of date setting or anything like that. The Bible is clear that there's no way for us to know the day or the hour that Christ is going to return. Okay? There's already been well more than enough people who have made the mistake of trying to do that. I'm not going to be someone to repeat that mistake. But Christ said that we can know the nearness of his coming. And we can see the seasons right now. As far as the spiritual leaves are concerned, we can see them falling off the leaves now. The time to kind of teeter-totter with certain decisions is over. We got to be in a position where we're ready for when this happens, that we can be those who say, "Lo, this is our God. We have waited for him."